All I wanted was a quiet flight in coach before the biggest meeting of my year. But the woman next to me, Diane Whitfield, took one look at my beat-up jacket, my phone with the cracked corner, and my economy ticket, and decided I wasn't worth a second glance. She mocked my line of work, informed me that a single father could never grasp the world of people who make real decisions, then bragged about the hundreds of millions waiting for her once we landed. I didn't say a word, not until the captain's voice came over the cabin speakers and used my name. The morning I left Denver, the sky over the mountains was the color of cold steel, and I remember thinking it matched exactly how I felt. My suitcase was small, gray, and old enough that the wheels squeaked against the terminal tile. My jacket had survived 9 winters and 2 trips to a tailor for the elbow. My laptop was a plain workhorse with a dent in the lid from the night I dropped it in a hangar parking lot. Nothing about me looked like a man about to shape the outcome of a $240 million deal. That was on purpose, and it was also just who I am. I've spent my whole career learning that the people who look like the answer are rarely the ones who actually have it. My name is Ryan Mitchell. I was 42 that morning. For 11 years, I built and tested avionics systems, crawling through the guts of aircraft in places where the metal got too hot to touch bare-handed. Now, I work as an independent safety and procurement advisor, a fancy way of saying that when an airline is about to spend a fortune on new technology, someone hires me to find out if the promises actually hold up. I don't sign contracts. I don't sit on boards. I write a report, and the people who do sign the contracts read it first. My phone buzzed while I was still in the security line. It was my daughter, Emma. Her message was short. She wanted to know if I'd be home by Saturday because she had something to show me and it couldn't wait past the weekend. I told her yes, that I'd be there, and that she shouldn't let her grandmother see it first. She sent back a laughing emoji, and I put the phone away and didn't check it again until we landed. That's all I'll say about her for now. She wasn't part of what happened next, and I've never believed in dragging a kid into a room full of adults behaving badly. Diane Whitfield arrived at the gate the way weather arrived. I heard her before I saw her, a voice pitched exactly loud enough to carry, telling someone on the phone that the deck needed to be reordered before Wheels Up in Seattle. Her luggage was matching leather with brass hardware. Her coat cost more than most people's first car. The gate agents straightened up without seeming to notice they were doing it. 2 of them traded a look that said they recognized the name on her ticket. She had the bearing of a woman who'd spent 20 years being the most important person in every room she walked into, and who'd long since stopped questioning whether that would always be true. She shouldn't have been in that boarding line at all. I learned later her Seattle meeting had gotten moved up almost a full day, and every seat up front was already gone. What was left was one aisle seat in row 32, next to a man in a 9-year-old jacket. When she found her row and checked the letter above the window, her mouth tightened just slightly. She looked at my seat, then my jacket, then my dented laptop, and ran the whole calculation in under 2 seconds. Maintenance guy, maybe, or a field tech flying home on the company's cheapest fare. I've watched people do that math on me for 20 years. I stopped correcting them a long time ago. I stood to let her in. She didn't say thanks, not even the automatic kind people say without thinking. She dropped into the aisle seat like the seat itself had personally let her down. Her assistant called twice more before the door closed, and both times she talked at full volume, tossing around numbers the way other people toss around jewelry. I opened my laptop, pulled up a technical annex I'd already read 4 times, and made myself small and quiet, a skill I learned early and never regretted. Diane claimed the armrest between us within the first 4 minutes, and she claimed it completely, like a country annexing a border. I let her have it. Some fights aren't worth the fuel, and I had a long day ahead. She spent the whole boarding window running her business at full volume, and the cabin around us learned things it had no business learning. She told someone the legal review was a formality. She told someone else that if the client's board wanted a phased rollout, they could want it quietly, because the pricing was built on a full fleet commitment, and she had no intention of renegotiating a single line of it. Then she said the number out loud. $240 million. She said it the way a man drops his keys on a bar to show you what he drives. The woman in the row ahead of us turned her head slightly, the way people do when they're pretending not to listen. Diane noticed and didn't care. That was the first thing I understood about her. She wasn't indiscreet by accident. She wanted that number hanging in the air, because the number was doing work her own presence apparently couldn't do alone anymore. Once the door closed and the phones went quiet, she looked at my screen for the first time. I had a maintenance interval reliability table open, gray, dense, the kind of document that puts most people to sleep in 11 seconds. She studied it like a menu written in a language she couldn't read. "Are you a mechanic?" she asked. No cruelty in it yet, just the flat certainty of someone sorting the world into useful and not useful. "Or do you work at the airport?" I told her I did some consulting in the industry. True and small on purpose, because I've learned the size of a description tells you almost nothing, but the size of a person's reaction to it tells you almost everything. She laughed. Not a real laugh, just that short exhale through the nose people use when they think they've caught you out. "Consulting," she repeated. "That word does a lot of heavy lifting these days." I asked what she meant, though I already knew. "I mean, half the people who tell me they consult are between jobs and decided to make it sound like a choice," she said. "No offense intended, just an observation." I told her none was taken. It was true. I'd heard some version of that sentence in a dozen airport lounges I wasn't paying to sit in. She turned toward me with a curiosity that had teeth in it. How old was I? When I told her, she nodded slowly, like something had been confirmed. She wanted to know why a man over 40 was flying coach on a business trip. Said the words business trip with just enough doubt to leave room for the idea I'd made the whole thing up. I told her the truth. I'm a single father, and I've never found a good reason to pay 4 times as much for 4 hours of my life. The seat lands in Seattle at exactly the same moment as every other seat on the plane. Something shifted in her face. Not sympathy, something closer to appetite. She'd been handed a category, and she started using it immediately. A single father in her filing system was a man whose ambitions had been amputated by circumstance. She asked whether it was hard running a consulting practice with a kid at home, whether that limited how far I could travel, how many clients I could take on. Every question sounded like concern and worked like a measurement. She wasn't asking about my daughter, she was calculating my ceiling, and she'd already decided where it was. I answered in short sentences, eyes on my screen, resisting the old temptation to say more than I should. 20 years in rooms full of confident people taught me the fastest way to learn what somebody actually believes is to hand them silence and watch what they fill it with. Diane filled it generously. By the time the plane finished taxiing, she laid out her whole philosophy of executive life like she was doing me a favor. "People who make real decisions don't buy cheap seats," she said. "They buy time. Time's the only resource you can't manufacture. Anyone who trades 4 hours of their own capacity to save a few $100s has just told you the true value of their hours." She said it pleasantly, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis when he doesn't expect the patient to make it. I told her I could think of a few people who bought time and still managed to waste it. She smiled like I'd said something charming and irrelevant. Then she went further and this is the part that stuck with me longest. She said she truly understood why a man in my position thought the way I did. Fatherhood, she explained, forces a choice. Chase the thing you might become, or protect the small, stable thing you already have. Most men in my situation choose stability, she said, and then tell themselves it was wisdom. She'd watched it happen to several promising people on her own staff. Not a criticism, she said, just the arithmetic of a life. I want to be precise here, because it matters. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't crude. She was doing something far more corrosive, treating a man's whole life as a case study in limitation while sitting 11 inches away from him. There's a particular kind of contempt that never raises its voice, and it does more damage in 10 minutes than open hostility does in a year. I didn't argue. There's no version of that argument a person wins, and I had zero interest in reciting my resume for a stranger. So I looked back at my screen, and that's when I saw what she'd pulled up on her tablet. A clean, white title slide, a word mark I'd been staring at in one form or another for 3 weeks. Whitfield Dynamics, Predictive Maintenance Architecture, Full Fleet Integration Proposal. I didn't react, though I'll admit my heart moved a little. In 11 years of this work, I'd never once had a coincidence land that squarely. I kept my face still and asked her one question as mildly as I could manage. What had the false positive rate come out to across the full validation series? Her hand went still on the screen. For the first time on that flight, Diane Whitfield looked at me as a person instead of a category. And what she felt wasn't respect, it was intrusion. "Excuse me?" she said. I repeated it. The false positive rate, the percentage of times the system flagged a healthy component as degrading. She asked what a consultant flying in coach could possibly know about predictive maintenance architecture. Lightly at first, but the lightness had gone thin, the way ice goes thin. I told her I didn't know anything about hers specifically, only that in my experience, numbers that come back beautiful are sometimes more worrying than numbers that come back ugly. An ugly number tells you where to look. A beautiful number tells you to stop looking. She held my eyes for a second, then gave a small, dismissive shake of her head and reached for the line people reach when they've run out of better ones. Reading a few technical articles doesn't mean you understand a $240 million transaction. I closed my laptop, not hard, just closed it, slid it into the seat pocket, folded my hands, and looked forward at the gray plastic bulkhead, letting the silence sit there like a third passenger. She went back to her slides. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see her read the same one 3 times. A few minutes later, the plane turned onto the runway, and Captain Mark Bennett came over the speakers with the ordinary pre-flight announcement every frequent flyer tunes out after the first sentence. Flight time to Seattle, 2 hours, 41 minutes. Some weather over the Cascades on descent. Cabin crew, prepare for departure. Good voice, unhurried, the voice of a man who's landed through worse than anything today would throw at him.
Then, at the end, it changed. Warmer by about 10 degrees. Slower. One more thing before we go. I want to send a personal welcome to Ryan Mitchell flying with us today. Good to have you back on board, Ryan. Some of us up here haven't forgotten. The click of Diane's stylus against her tablet stopped mid-stroke. I lifted my chin about an inch, what a man does when he's being thanked in front of 200 strangers and badly wants it to end. I didn't turn around. I didn't look at the woman next to me. I've never once enjoyed a moment like that, and I've learned the fastest way to survive one is to give it nothing to feed on. It wasn't over. The senior flight attendant came down the aisle 4 minutes after the seatbelt sign went off and stopped at row 32, hand on the seat back, a look on her face I recognized. She was somewhere near 60, with the calm of a woman who'd worked through decompressions and diversions and 100 bad nights. She leaned in slightly. "Forgive me," she said. "When the captain said Ryan Mitchell, did he mean the Ryan Mitchell from the Horizon program?" I told her he did. She put her hand briefly on my shoulder and said something quiet about a winter 8 years back and a fleet that had come very close to a very bad month, and thank you, in a way that made clear she wasn't saying it just for herself. I asked her, as gently as I could, not to make more of it. She understood immediately, gave a small nod, and went on with the beverage service like nothing had happened. Diane hadn't moved. I want to be clear about what that moment actually was, because it wasn't the twist. It was a door cracking open, and what she saw through it was only that the man she'd spent 40 minutes pitying was known by name to a captain and remembered by a crew. It didn't tell her what I did or why. It just broke the category she'd built for me, and a broken category is the most uncomfortable thing you can hand someone who organizes the world by rank. What unsettled her more, I think, was what I did next. Nothing. I didn't turn to her. I didn't offer a modest little explanation designed to be repeated later. I didn't say the sentence every part of her was braced to hear, the one that starts with "actually" and ends with her looking small. I just took my laptop back out of the seat pocket, opened the same gray reliability table, and kept reading. There's no counterattack that costs a proud person more than discovering you never intended to attack at all. She sat with that for the length of a beverage cart. I could feel the shape of her thinking beside me. Once we'd leveled off and the engine noise settled into that long, steady hush, she did something I'd half expected, opened a different folder on her tablet and started going backward through the deal documentation, the version her own legal team had assembled months earlier.
I didn't have to look. I knew what was in the back of that file, because I'd written part of it. Near the end, in the appendix, listing external parties and review obligations, there's a line that reads, "Independent technical review conducted by R. Mitchell. Findings to be submitted to the board prior to authorization vote." She read it. I heard her stop breathing for about a second and a half, a very specific sound when you're close enough to feel someone's sleeve move. She told me later what she remembered, a conversation the previous winter, her general counsel mentioning that the airline intended to bring in an outside advisor for technical evaluation, and her waving it off in under a minute. Procedural, she'd called it, box checking, the kind of thing big airlines do so their insurers sleep better. She'd never bothered to ask for a name, because names like that had never mattered to her, and because in her experience, the people who write reports work for the people who read them. The questions started about 10 minutes later in a completely different register. What took me to Seattle? Did I know anyone at the airline personally? What exactly had the Horizon program been? Asked in a voice that had discovered warmth the way a desert discovers rain. I gave her enough and not a syllable more. Yes, work. Yes, I knew some people there. Horizon was a system integrity issue from years back, and I'd been part of the team that found it and closed it. "Part of the team?" she repeated. I told her anything worth doing gets done by teams, and anyone who says otherwise is selling something. She laughed at that, and this laugh was different. This one was working. She started building a bridge in real time, and it was fascinating and a little sad to watch. Whitfield Dynamics was always looking for experienced people with real operational depth, she said. The industry was full of theorists and starved for practitioners. She offered to introduce me to two executives whose names she clearly expected to mean something, and then she said that if I ever wanted to talk about a more permanent arrangement, with compensation that reflected what someone with my history was actually worth, her door was extremely open. I let her finish, then asked one question, keeping my voice as flat and unarmed as I could make it. How was it that 10 minutes ago I was a man who'd traded ambition for stability, and now I was a practitioner with real operational depth? She opened her mouth. Nothing came out for a moment. Then something about first impressions being an imperfect instrument, about the pace of her life making her blunt sometimes, about meaning no personal disrespect. It wasn't an apology, it was a renovation. She wasn't sorry for what she'd said, she was sorry about who she'd said it to. Those two things live in entirely different houses. I understood, and I did. That's the part people miss when they hear this story. I wasn't angry with her. I've never found anger useful in a pressurized tube at 36,000 feet. What I felt sitting there was something colder and more professional, because I'd just learned something about Whitfield dynamics that no document had told me, and I'd learned it for free. I'd learned that the person running the company recalibrated her entire assessment of a human being the instant she discovered he had power over her, which meant necessarily she recalibrated in the other direction too, which meant somewhere inside her company there were people whose warnings had been weighed not on content, but on rank. So I started asking questions. Not an interrogation. I have no taste for those, and they don't work anyway. I just started handing her back the things she'd already told me, rearranged slightly. She'd mentioned the validation series ran across more than 10,000 operational cycles, genuinely impressive for a system at that stage. So why did the final submission to the board draw its conclusions from a subset of roughly 6,000? The full set included early development cycles that weren't representative, she said. Reasonable, and it is in principle. So which criterion defined representative, and had that criterion been set before the data came in or after? She didn't answer that one. I asked about the anomaly classifications, how in the summary that reached the board, a category labeled operator anomalies had grown, meaning the system had flagged an alert and the cause had been traced to human procedure rather than software. Legitimate category exists in every system I've ever evaluated. So how many of those events had been reclassified from an earlier label, and how many reclassifications had been signed off by an engineer rather than a program manager? She asked where I was getting this. One more. Why had a reliability engineering group inside her own company formally requested an extended retest, and why had that request been declined without a written technical rationale? The cabin got very quiet around us. Somewhere ahead, a kid was watching something on a tablet a little too loud. Diane sat with her hands flat on the tray table, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her yet. Fear, wearing a suit. None of that is in the public materials, she said. I told her that was correct. Then where are you getting it? I said people who do this kind of work tend to read the pages chief executives skip. She wanted to know if I'd planned this, if the seat had been arranged, if the whole flight was some kind of setup engineered by the airline to rattle her before the meeting. I told her the truth, and it's worth stating plainly. I had no idea she'd be on that plane. I didn't know what she looked like. I booked my own travel, pay for it out of my own fee, and I'd chosen that flight 9 days earlier because it was $11 cheaper than the one before it. The seat next to mine get assigned by a computer that had never heard of either of us. Then I said the part I think she found hardest. In the 90 minutes since she'd sat down, she'd told me the deal size, the pricing structure, her position on a phased rollout, her opinion of her own legal review, her opinion of engineers, and her opinion of men who fly coach. I'd asked her for none of it. Everything she'd handed me because she believed the person beside her didn't matter enough to be careful around. She said, very quietly, that she supposed that was fair. Somewhere over eastern Washington, I decided to tell her the part she had a right to know, because I don't believe in ambushing people, even people who'd spent an hour making it clear they'd ambush me without a second thought. 3 weeks before that flight, a reliability engineer at Whitfield Dynamics named Naomi Price used the company's formal technical escalation channel to send an unfiltered log set to the review group at the airline. She did it correctly, didn't leak it to a journalist, didn't post it anywhere, didn't go around her leadership in secret. She used the exact mechanism written into the contract between the two companies, precisely so findings can move when they need to. And here's what matters most. Naomi Price never accused anyone of fraud, never used the word. Her position was narrower and much harder to dismiss. She demonstrated that the data set presented to the board had excluded a specific cluster of unfavorable results, and that the exclusion had never been documented with a technical justification an outside evaluator could test. That's not a crime. In plenty of companies, it isn't even unusual. But when the system being sold decides whether an aircraft component gets pulled before it fails, the gap between an undocumented exclusion and a documented one is the entire job. I was the one assigned to verify her claim. That's why I was on that plane, with a folder of raw logs I'd spent 19 days working through, on my way to give a board of directors an answer. I watched Diane's face while I said the name, and I saw it land. She remembered Naomi Price very well, though not for anything Naomi had built. She remembered her as the 29-year-old engineer who'd stood up in a quarterly review the previous spring and started walking a room full of executives through a variance chart nobody had asked for. And she remembered exactly what she'd said to make it stop. "When I want an opinion from engineering, I'll ask for one," said in front of 31 people. She admitted that to me on the plane, didn't have to. I think she said it because she was already assembling her defense and hadn't yet realized the sentence was the indictment. I told her what I actually believed. The problem in front of her wasn't a software defect. Those are ordinary and fixable. Every serious system has them. The problem was that a 29-year-old engineer had found something, tried to raise it through the proper channel, gotten publicly humiliated for the attempt, and watched the concern get quietly reclassified and buried in an appendix. A defect is survivable. A culture that makes the defect invisible isn't, because a culture like that guarantees the next finding gets buried too, and the one after that, until eventually one of them is the one that matters. When a chief executive teaches an organization that bad news is a career risk, the organization doesn't stop producing bad news, it just stops delivering it upward. And then the chief executive stands in front of a board with a set of beautiful numbers, genuinely unaware she's lying. Diane didn't respond for a long moment. When she did, her voice had lost the performance entirely, and what was underneath sounded tired in a way that made her, briefly, someone I could recognize. She told me she'd built that company from 9 people in a leased warehouse, that she'd been the only woman in the room for the first 12 years and learned early that hesitation reads as weakness, that if she'd ever once said, "I'm not sure," she'd have been finished. She said it not as an excuse, but as a fact, and I believe it was one. I told her I didn't doubt any of it. And then I told her the part I suspect she's still turning over, that the armor that gets you into the room is very often the exact thing that blinds you once you're standing in it. By the time we started our descent, she'd moved into the last phase, and I've seen it enough times to recognize it on sight. the negotiation phase. It always shows up disguised as collaboration. She proposed we solve it together. 4 hours between landing and the board session, and in 4 hours a lot could be corrected. Her team could pull the complete cycle set, reconstruct the classification decisions, present the whole thing openly, get ahead of it. She wanted my help shaping how it was framed, because I understood the technical material better than anyone else she could reach that morning, and a joint presentation would demonstrate good faith. I told her reconstructing the data was exactly the right instinct, and she should absolutely do it. I also told her I couldn't touch it. Then she made the offer. Elegantly. To be fair to her, she didn't put a number on the table like a bribe. She said whatever the airline was paying me for a 3-week engagement, Whitfield Dynamics could offer a standing advisory role at a multiple of it. She said a man raising a daughter alone should think seriously about what that kind of stability would mean. She said it kindly. That was the worst part. She'd spent an hour using my daughter as evidence of my limitations, and now she was using her as leverage, and I don't think she noticed she'd done both. I said no. No heat in it, because there was no decision to make. I'd been retained by the airline to evaluate her company's proposal, and accepting anything from the party under evaluation wouldn't just look like a conflict of interest, it would be one. The moment I took anything from her, my report was worthless. And if my report was worthless, Naomi Price had risked her career for nothing. And 19 days in those logs were wasted. The only thing I actually sell is the credibility of my findings. And I have exactly one of those. It doesn't come back once it's gone.
She took it better than I expected, nodded, looked out the window at the cloud deck coming up to meet us, and for about 90 seconds we were just two tired people descending into Seattle. I think right up until the aircraft door opened, she was still holding on to a version of events where I was one voice among several, an outside advisor, a report that would sit in a stack alongside her legal team's memos and her own team's rebuttal, weighed against a 9-year commercial relationship and a company of her size. Uncomfortable, survivable. Then the door opened, and a man in a charcoal suit with an airline credential on a lanyard was standing on the jet bridge, scanning faces coming off the plane. When he found mine, his whole posture changed. His name was David Reynolds, and he ran operations integration for the airline. He came forward, shook my hand, didn't look at anyone else. "Mr. Langley is holding the room," he said. "The board won't vote until you have your final assessment. He asked me to tell you personally they'll wait as long as you need." Diane was 3 feet behind me with her bag over her shoulder, and she heard every word. I introduced them because it would have been cruel and unprofessional not to. David shook her hand with the flawless courtesy of a man who'd been briefed. She said the appropriate things. Her voice was perfect. Her face wasn't. That was the moment. Not the captain's greeting, which only made her curious. Not the appendix, which only made her uneasy. It was standing on a jet bridge in Seattle, hearing a senior airline executive explain that a board of directors was sitting in a room waiting on the opinion of the man she'd spent 2 hours and 41 minutes explaining the world to. I didn't say anything about it. I picked up my small gray suitcase and walked up the jet bridge, and I didn't look back because there was nothing back there I wanted. The airline's headquarters sit south of the city with a view of the water and a lobby much quieter than people expect. Diane arrived 20 minutes ahead of me with 4 people from her team, and by the time I walked in, she'd rebuilt herself completely. A real skill, and I won't pretend otherwise. The coat was off, the presentation was loaded, her chief technology officer was at her right hand.
She moved through that lobby with the same weatherfront certainty she'd brought to the gate in Denver. I heard her in the corridor telling her people to run the deck exactly as planned. No changes, no preemptive concessions. She believed, and there was a logic to it, that a 9-year commercial relationship and a company of her scale would carry more weight in that room than a technical memo from a single outside advisor. She believed the deal had gravity of its own. I came in last, in the same jacket I'd worn on the plane, carrying the same dented laptop. No team, no entourage, nobody carrying anything for me. Everett Langley was 63, had been chairman of that board for 9 of those years, and is the least theatrical, powerful person I've ever worked with. He was standing near the head of the table, talking to 2 directors when I came through the door. He stopped mid-sentence and shook my hand before he greeted anyone else in the room. "Ryan," he said, "thank you for coming. Take whatever time you need." Then he turned and welcomed Diane warmly and correctly, and offered her the chair to his left. I watched her absorb the order of those 2 things. In a room like that, sequence isn't decoration. Sequence is information. Everyone at that table understood exactly what they'd just seen. So did she. She sat down with a composure that must have cost her more than anything else she did that day. We opened with her presentation, because that was the agenda, and Everett Langley doesn't rearrange agendas to make a point. Her team was good. The architecture genuinely was impressive. Her chief technology officer knew the material cold, and the projected savings across a fleet that size weren't fantasy. Through it all, I said nothing about the flight, not one word, not one look. I had no intention of ever mentioning it, and I still wouldn't be telling you about it now if the consequences hadn't gone public on their own. I could see what that silence was doing to her. She kept glancing at me between slides, waiting for the moment I'd use it, because in her model of the world, that's what a man in my position does with an advantage. The not knowing was worse for her than any accusation would have been. She was preparing a defense against a weapon I was never going to pick up. When they finished, Everett turned to me and asked for the independent assessment. I gave it in 19 minutes, and there was nothing in it about a seat assignment. I said the predictive maintenance architecture was technically credible, and in several respects ahead of what else was available at that price. I said the concept was sound, and I didn't believe anyone had built the system in bad faith. Then I laid out what I'd found in the logs. I showed the full 10,000 cycle series next to the 6,000 cycle subset the board had received. I showed the excluded cluster wasn't randomly distributed. It concentrated in the specific high humidity operating conditions that describe roughly a third of that airline's route network. I showed the reclassified alerts and the missing engineering sign-off. I showed the declined retest request and the blank space where a technical rationale should have been. Then I said the harder part, the part most advisors leave out because it isn't strictly technical. The data problem was recoverable. The governance problem wasn't, not yet. I told the board that a supplier organization where a documented engineering concern can be publicly dismissed by its chief executive, then quietly reclassified downstream, is a supplier organization whose future data can't be relied on, no matter how good the engineering underneath it is. They wouldn't be buying a system. They'd be buying 9 years of that company's judgment about which results to show them. My recommendation was to freeze authorization of the $240 million agreement in full, not cancel it, freeze it. a limited pilot program on 11 aircraft, contingent on 3 conditions: an independent audit of the complete validation dataset, full restoration and documentation of every excluded result, and a formal enforceable protection for the internal engineering staff who'd raised the original concern, so no one at that company would ever again pay a price for being right early. Diane stood up before I'd fully sat down. In front of the entire board, she said this was personal, that we'd traveled together that morning, that there'd been a disagreement, and that the timing and tone of my recommendation extraordinary. The room went very still. Everett didn't move. I looked at her and said the only thing I said to her all day that wasn't strictly professional, quietly, because it didn't need volume. I told her she hadn't lost this deal because she disrespected me. She'd lost it because she disrespects everyone she's decided she'll never need. A young engineer with a variance chart, a room she talks over, a man in a coach seat. I'd been on the receiving end of it for 2 hours, and it cost me nothing at all. I got off the plane and went to work. But Naomi Price had been on the receiving end of it in a quarterly review in front of 31 people, and that had cost her company $250 million, because after that day, nobody in her building was ever going to walk a difficult chart into a room again. Everett let that sit exactly as long as it needed. Then he did the thing that ended it. He told Diane that the board had received the escalated technical material 11 days before that morning's flight, through the formal channel written into their own agreement, and that my engagement had been authorized on a date he then read aloud from the record. No edge in it at all. He wasn't scoring a point. He was closing an exit, because he didn't want her leaving that building believing a story that would stop her from fixing anything. The vote wasn't close. Authorization of the full agreement was suspended unanimously. The limited pilot remained available under the 3 conditions, and I understand her counsel spent the following weeks negotiating the shape of the audit rather than the fact of it. She wasn't destroyed. I want to be clear about that, because the ending people expect isn't the ending that happened. No arrests, no company collapsing overnight. What she got was slower, and I suspect considerably worse. The biggest transaction of her year evaporated on a Tuesday afternoon. Her own board convened within 9 days and asked her to account for how a data set had reached a customer's directors in a condition she couldn't defend. Her leadership, for the first time in 19 years, became a question instead of an assumption, and she had to sit in a conference room and explain out loud why the only person in her building willing to put the truth in writing had been an engineer she'd shamed in public. As I was gathering my things, she came over near the door. Her team was already in the corridor. She asked me one question, and I don't think she asked it to be clever. She wanted to know why a man with that kind of influence flies coach. I told her I pay my own travel when I do independent work, because the moment a company pays for my seat, the seat starts having an opinion. And I told her the rest of it, which is simpler. I don't need an expensive chair to know who I am. If I ever do, I'll have already stopped being useful at this job. She asked if that was something I'd learned somewhere. I said it was something I was trying to teach. My daughter is 14. The only thing I've ever really wanted her to understand is that a person's worth doesn't change according to the seat they happen to be sitting in, including her own. Then I picked up my suitcase and left. I didn't feel anything people assume I felt. No triumph in it. There's never triumph in watching a capable person discover what their own habits have cost them. I made my flight home. Emma showed me the thing that couldn't wait until Sunday, a bridge she'd built out of dry spaghetti that held 11 pounds before it failed. She'd written down exactly why it failed, which pleased me more than the bridge did. I heard later from David Reynolds that Diane stayed in that conference room for a while after everyone else had gone. He said she was standing near the empty chair I'd been sitting in, not looking at anything in particular. I've thought about that more than I expected to, because the truth of that morning isn't that she insulted the wrong man. The truth is that for 2 hours and 41 minutes, she sat 11 inches away from the one person alive who'd read every page of what was going wrong inside her own company, who had the complete picture, and who would have told her all of it if she'd asked a single genuine question. She never asked. She looked at a 9-year-old jacket, a cracked phone, and a ticket in row 32, and decided the man attached to them had nothing to say worth hearing. That decision cost her $240 million, and the thing I keep coming back to is that it wasn't even the most expensive one she made that year. It was only the one where the bill finally arrived.